Hi, I'm Ruby Grant, 30 years old, and I never thought I'd be the stranger at my own family's table. But at my parents' 35th anniversary party, my brother stood up, raised his glass, and thanked them for raising their only child. Their only child. I was sitting right there 5 feet away, my plate untouched, my heart pounding. My mom smiled, her eyes sparkling like she'd just heard the sweetest truth. My dad nodded proud like it was a moment they'd rehearsed. No one flinched. No one corrected him. The room kept buzzing, glasses clinking, cousins laughing as if I'd never existed. That wasn't just a toast. It was a declaration, a line drawn in the sand with my name erased. I didn't scream or cry. I didn't even blink. Instead, I reached into my bag, pulled out a small, neatly wrapped box, and set it on the table. "Don't open it yet," I said softly, my voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the noise. Every head turned. My brother's grin faltered. My parents' smiles froze. They didn't know it, but that box held something that would unravel everything they thought they could hide. If you've ever felt rejected by your own family or pushed to the sidelines like I was, drop a 1 in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from and share your story. Don't forget to follow because the ending to this story will keep you hooked. I'd spent years trying to fit into a family that never seemed to see me, and the memories came rushing back sharp and unyielding. They weren't just moments. They were proof of how long I'd been invisible. 2 years ago, I spent weeks planning my mother's 50th birthday. I'd saved up to buy Doris Grant a custom necklace, a silver pendant with her initials carved in delicate script. I wrapped it carefully, wrote a card about how much she meant to me, and drove 3 hours to Wichita to surprise her. When I handed it over, her eyes barely flicked to the box. "Oh, that's nice," she said, setting it on the kitchen counter next to a stack of napkins. My brother got her a new coffee maker. Nothing fancy, just something he grabbed last minute. She spent the whole dinner gushing about how it made her mornings perfect. My necklace. Never saw it again. I checked her jewelry box once, months later. It wasn't there. Then there was Shane Grant's big promotion party last summer. He'd climbed the ladder at his finance firm, and the family threw a bash at a local steakhouse. I found out about it from a cousin's Instagram post, smiling faces, champagne flutes, my parents beaming like they'd won the lottery. I wasn't invited. Not a text, not a call, not even a casual mention. When I asked my father, Lawrence Grant, about it later, he shrugged. "Thought you were busy," he said, then changed the subject to Shane's new corner office. I wasn't busy. I was home scrolling through photos of a celebration I didn't know existed. The worst came a year ago when I lost my job as a freelance graphic designer. Bills piled up and I was drowning in late notices. I swallowed my pride and texted my parents asking for a small loan, just enough to cover rent until I got back on my feet. I sent the message to our family group chat, the one Shane always dominated with his work updates. No reply. Not from my mother, not from my father, not even a sorry or check-in later. I sent a follow-up, then another. Silence. A week later, I saw my mother post a photo of Shane's new car, a sleek sedan he'd bought with their help. I stared at my phone, the unanswered texts glaring back, and felt something harden inside me. It wasn't just the big moments. It was the small ones too, the ones that cut deeper because they were so ordinary. Like the time I called my mother to share that I'd landed a big client, my first real break in months. She listened for 10 seconds before saying, "Hold on, your brother's on the other line." She never called back. Or the family barbecue where my father spent an hour bragging about Shane's latest deal but didn't ask me a single question. I sat there smiling, nodding, playing the part I'd always played while my stomach twisted. The rumors were what broke the surface. A few months before the anniversary party, my cousin Bailey Vaughn pulled me aside at a coffee shop. She looked uneasy, stirring her latte too long before speaking. "Your parents told everyone you don't want to be part of the family anymore," she said, her voice low. "They said you're too busy, too independent." I froze, my coffee going cold in my hands. Me. the one who'd spent years calling, texting, showing up with gifts, and Hope Bailey said my mother had been telling relatives I'd checked out that I didn't care about them. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a story they'd crafted to explain why I was never around, when the truth was, they'd stopped inviting me. Then there was Curtis Ford, another cousin who texted me out of the blue a week before the party. "Heard you're done with us," he wrote, half joking, half curious. "Your brother mentioned you don't come to family stuff anymore." I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the keyboard. Shane had said that? The same Shane who got every spotlight, every cheer while I was left scraping for a glance. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my phone's gallery, scrolling through screenshots I'd saved over the years, texts I'd sent my parents begging for a response, asking for help sharing my life. Everyone ignored. One from last winter stood out. "Hey Mom, Dad, I'm really struggling. Can we talk?" Sent read. No reply. Below it, a photo of them at Shane's holiday party, all smiles, posted the same day. All of that came rushing back as I sat in the dining room in the middle of my parents' 35th anniversary celebration. A long oak table stretched across the space, covered in crisp white linen piled high with silver platters of roasted chicken, glazed carrots, and creamy mashed potatoes. Crystal chandeliers hung above their warm light, catching vases of roses and lilies, the flowers deep reds and whites glowing like they were meant to steal the show. Wine glasses clinked, laughter spilled from every corner, and the buzz of conversation felt like a living thing. I sat at the far end, squeezed between an aunt who hadn't said a word to me all night and a cousin's new boyfriend who kept fumbling my name. My brother Shane stood at the head of the room, his posture tall and confident, his suit sharp as a blade. He was the center of it all, pulling every eye like a magnet. My mother leaned toward him, her face lit with a pride I'd never felt aimed my way. My father rested a hand on Shane's shoulder, his smile wide and steady as if I wasn't even there. No one asked about my life. No one noticed my plate still full, or the way my hand stayed folded in my lap. I'd spent years perfecting the art of fading into the background, smiling just enough to dodge questions, pretending I belonged at this table. The chatter flowed around me, cousins swapping stories about their kids, aunts gushing over recipes, uncles debating football scores. I was a ghost. My presence barely a whisper in the room's warmth. Shane, though, soaked up every glance, every laugh, his voice, cutting through the noise like he was born to lead it. I watched him work the crowd, his gestures smooth, his charm effortless, and felt the familiar ache of being overlooked, not just tonight, but for years. When Shane raised his glass, the room fell silent. His voice was polished, the kind that made people lean in, eager for every word. "To the two people who shaped me," he said, turning to my parents with a smile that felt rehearsed. "The best parents anyone could ask for." Glasses lifted, soft murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, and I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe just this once he'd say my name. Maybe someone would turn to me, acknowledge me. But then Shane's grin widened, his eyes glinting with confidence. "And thank you for raising the best only child in the world." The words landed like a stone through glass, sharp and shattering. I held my breath, waiting for someone to laugh, to correct him, to say, "What about Ruby?" But my mother raised her glass higher, her smile tight and unwavering. My father chuckled, his nod automatic, like this was a script they'd all memorized. The room erupted in applause, cousins and aunts cheering, their voices blending into a wall of sound that drowned me out. That wasn't a slip, it was a choice. They weren't forgetting me. They were erasing me, rewriting our family to fit a story where I didn't exist. My pulse pounded, my chest tight, but I didn't flinch. I didn't let my face betray the ache tearing through me. I sat there, hands still in my lap, staring at the untouched food on my plate. Shane kept talking, his voice carrying over the clinking glasses, joking about some childhood memory that of course only featured him. My mother laughed, her hand brushing his arm. My father nodded, his eyes fixed on Shane like he was the only one in the room worth seeing. Bailey, sitting across from me, glanced my way for a split second before looking down at her plate. Curtis, a few seats over, shifted uncomfortably, his fork scraping against his china. The cousins' chatter resumed, but it felt distant, like static in my ears. I'd always known they favored Shane, but this was different. This was a public declaration, a line drawn in front of everyone we knew. The laughter, the cheers, the clinking glasses, they weren't just celebrating my parents' marriage. They were celebrating a family that didn't include me. I gripped the edge of my chair, my knuckles white, but I kept my expression steady. I'd spent years swallowing this feeling, pretending it didn't cut, but tonight it was sharper, clearer. This wasn't about forgetting. This was about choosing to leave me out. And as I sat there surrounded by their voices, their smiles, their world, I knew I couldn't stay silent forever. Something was shifting inside me, not anger, not yet, but a quiet resolve that I wasn't going to let them write me out without a fight. Sitting at that table, surrounded by the clinking glasses and laughter, I felt the weight of Shane's words settle like a stone in my chest. His toast, "the best only child in the world," still echoed my mother's smile, and my father's nod burning in my mind. The room was alive, but I was done being invisible. I reached into my purse, my fingers brushing the cool surface of a small box wrapped in silver paper tied with a red ribbon. It wasn't a gift in the way they'd expect. It was something I'd pieced together just days before, after a cousin's slip about family finances sparked my suspicion. I'd spent hours digging through old emails and papers, uncovering a truth I hadn't fully grasped until then. Now it was time to let it speak. I stood my chair, scraping the hardwood floor, and the chatter faltered. Every eye turned to me, some curious, some confused. Shane's glass paused mid-air, his grin twitching. Doris's eyes narrowed, her fingers tightening around her wine glass. Lawrence's brow creased, like he was trying to place me in his story. I walked to the center of the table, my steps slow and deliberate, and set the box down in front of my parents. "Don't open it yet," I said, my voice low but steady, cutting through the room's hum. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. The box held something they'd buried for years, and I wasn't going to beg for their acknowledgement anymore. I turned and walked toward the door, my pulse racing but my face calm, leaving the box behind like a ticking clock. I'd barely reached the hallway when I heard Doris's voice, sharp and impatient. "What's this supposed to be?" she said, and I knew what was coming. Against my words, they tore into the silver paper, the ribbon falling to the table. A gasp cut through the room, followed by a low murmur that grew louder, angrier. I paused at the doorway, glancing back. Shane was leaning over the table, his face pale, as he sifted through the papers inside letters from a lawyer, emails between my parents, financial records I'd found after that cousin's hint. They laid it bare. Doris and Lawrence had quietly transferred the family's entire estate to Shane, cutting me out without a word. No discussion, no notice, just a decision made behind my back. Doris's voice broke, a half-shout, half-whisper. "This is a mistake," she insisted, shoving the papers toward Lawrence. He grabbed them, his hands shaking, his eyes scanning the words as if they'd change under his gaze. "It's not what it looks like," he stammered, but the room wasn't listening. Bailey, sitting nearby, stood up, her chair clattering. "You did this without telling her?" she asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. Curtis, a few seats over, shook his head, muttering something to the cousin next to him. The guests' murmurs turned into a chorus of questions, accusations, their faces twisting with shock and judgment. An aunt I barely knew pointed at the papers, her voice rising. "How could you cut your own daughter out?" she demanded, and others nodded, their whispers turning to shouts. Shane slammed his hand on the table, the glasses rattling. "This is private," he snapped, but his voice cracked, betraying his panic. Doris clutched the papers to her chest, her eyes darting around the room, searching for an ally. "You don't understand," she said, her tone desperate. "We were protecting the family, but the guests weren't buying it." A cousin I hadn't seen in years leaned forward, his voice cold. "Protecting who exactly?" he asked, and the question hung in the air unanswered. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, fingers pointing, the celebration unraveling like a dropped thread. My parents' faces were ashen, their excuses drowned out by the growing outrage. Shane tried to speak again, but his words were lost in the noise, his charm useless against the truth. I didn't stay to watch it all fall apart. I stepped through the doorway, my steps steady, the sounds of their arguments fading behind me. The box had done its job, not because I wanted their apologies, but because I wanted them to see what they'd done. I'd found those papers by chance, a careless email forwarded by a relative who didn't know what they meant. But I knew. It wasn't just about money, it was about being erased, about years of being pushed aside, finally laid bare. As I walked out into the cool Wichita night, my breath visible in the air, I felt lighter. Not because they'd change, but because I'd stopped waiting for them to. The chaos I left behind wasn't my burden anymore. They'd opened the box, and the truth was theirs to face. The chaos of that anniversary party faded as I drove away, but the weight of what I'd left behind lingered. The box, those papers, the truth, they were out now, and there was no going back. 3 days later, my phone buzzed with an email from a law firm I didn't recognize. The subject line was stark: cease and desist. My hand steadied as I opened it, but my pulse quickened. The letter, signed by a lawyer representing Doris and Lawrence, demanded I retract the documents I'd revealed at the party. They called them misleading, accused me of causing emotional distress and disrupting family harmony. They threatened to sue if I didn't comply, claiming I'd fabricated the evidence to smear them. The words stung, but not because they hurt. They were a desperate attempt to bury what everyone had seen. I wasn't surprised. I'd expected them to fight back, to twist the narrative like they always had. I didn't reply. Instead, I called a lawyer I'd met through a freelance client, a woman named Karen who specialized in family law. I laid out everything: the papers I'd found, the emails, the lawyer's letter from my parents. Karen didn't flinch. "They've got no case," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Those documents are airtight. You're entitled to your share of the estate." By the end of the week, we'd filed a lawsuit against Doris and Lawrence, demanding my rightful portion of the family trust. The papers I'd left in that box, letters from their lawyer, emails outlining the transfer to Shane, financial records showing the estate's value, were my leverage. I'd stumbled across them just before the party thanks to a careless email from a distant relative who didn't realize what they'd sent. Now they were my weapon. But I wasn't done. Sitting at my desk, I opened my laptop and scrolled through the screenshots I'd saved, texts I'd sent my parents years ago, begging for help when I lost my job, asking to talk when I was struggling. Each one was unanswered, ignored, a digital record of their neglect. I'd held on to them, not knowing why, until now. I drafted a post for Twitter and Facebook, careful but deliberate. I uploaded a screenshot of one text: "Hey Mom, Dad, I'm really struggling. Can we talk?" Sent read, no reply. Below it, I shared a single page from the financial records, redacted to avoid specifics, but clear enough to show the truth: my parents had funneled everything to Shane, leaving me nothing. My caption was simple: "This is what it feels like to be erased by your own family." I hit post, my hands steady, my heart racing. The response was immediate. By morning, my phone was buzzing with notifications. Friends from Wichita, old classmates, even strangers shared my posts, their comments flooding in. "That's awful," one wrote. "How could they do that to you?" another asked. A local business owner I barely knew messaged me, "You're not alone. My family did something similar." The post spread beyond Wichita, picking up thousands of likes and retweets. A community group in town shared it, calling out family secrets that hurt the ones who deserve better. I watched the numbers climb, each share a crack in the perfect image my parents had built. Doris called me that afternoon, her voice sharp over the phone. "You're humiliating us," she said. "Not asking, not apologizing. Take it down." I didn't argue. I didn't beg for her to see my side. "You made your choice." I said, my voice calm but firm, and hung up. Shane sent a text an hour later. This is low even for you. I didn't reply. Lawrence stayed silent as always. Their anger didn't shake me, it confirmed I'd hit a nerve. The truth wasn't just mine anymore. It was out there, seen by hundreds, then thousands. Carla Newman, my closest friend since college, showed up at my apartment that evening with takeout and a bottle of wine. "You're tougher than they'll ever know," she said, her smile warm but fierce. She'd been there when I lost my job, when my parents ignored my calls, and now she sat with me scrolling through the comments, reading the ones that made us laugh, the ones that made us pause. Vernon Tate, another friend who'd always been more family than my own, called later that night. "You did what you had to," he said, his voice steady. "Don't let them make you doubt it." Their support wasn't just words, it was a lifeline pulling me through the storm of my family's backlash. By the next day, the story had reached local news blogs. A small Wichita outlet ran a piece. "Family dispute goes viral, sparks debate on fairness." My parents' friends, their church group, even their neighbors started pulling back. Bailey texted me, her words hesitant. "I didn't know it was this bad. I'm sorry." Curtis stayed quiet, but I saw he'd unfollowed Shane on social media. The family's polished image was crumbling, their reputation unraveling with every share, every comment. They'd spent years painting me as the one who didn't care, but now the truth was out, and no amount of their excuses could cover it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The lawsuit was moving forward, Karen confident we'd win. The social media posts weren't about revenge, they were about taking back my voice. I'd been silent too long, letting their lies define me. Now the world knew I wasn't the one who walked away, they were. 6 weeks after my social media post went viral, the courtroom ruling came down like a hammer. The judge didn't hesitate. The documents I'd presented, those letters, emails, and financial records, proved Doris and Lawrence had wrongfully excluded me from the family trust. The estate, built from decades of my parents' savings and investments, was ordered to be split equitably. I'd get my share, a portion substantial enough to change my life, though I hadn't done this for the money. It was about justice, about forcing them to face what they'd done. The news spread through Wichita like wildfire, whispered in coffee shops, shared in church groups, posted in local forums. My parents' carefully crafted image, the perfect couple, the generous pillars of the community, crumbled under the weight of their own choices. Shane took the hardest hit. His polished reputation as the golden son unraveled online. Comments flooded his social media, calling him out for benefiting from an unfair deal. "How do you sleep knowing you took everything from your sister?" one stranger wrote. Another, a former colleague, posted, "Didn't know you were that kind of guy, Shane." His finance firm's clients started asking questions, and I heard through a mutual friend he'd lost a major deal because of the family drama. Shane tried to fight back, posting a vague defense about private matters, but it only fueled the fire. People in Wichita don't take kindly to favoritism, especially when it's splashed across Twitter for all to see. His charm, once his greatest asset, couldn't save him now. Doris and Lawrence didn't fare much better. Their friends, the ones who'd clapped so eagerly at that anniversary party, began pulling away. Their church group, once a weekly gathering of warm smiles and potlucks, stopped inviting them to events. A neighbor I barely knew messaged me saying she'd overheard Doris at the grocery store trying to explain to an old friend why they'd cut me out. It was for the family's future, Doris had said, but the friend just walked away, shaking her head. Lawrence, always the quieter one, stopped showing up at his usual golf outings. Their social circle, built over decades in Wichita, shrank to a handful of loyalists who didn't ask questions. The rest turned their backs, unwilling to be tied to a scandal that had gone public. Bailey and Curtis, my cousins, stepped back too. Bailey sent me one more text after her apology, a short message saying she didn't want to pick sides but wished me well. I didn't reply. Curtis unfollowed Shane online and stopped attending family gatherings, according to a mutual acquaintance. They weren't part of the trust dispute, but the fallout touched them anyway. Neither wanted to be associated with a family now known for betrayal. In a small city like Wichita, where everyone knows everyone, their choice made sense. Guilt by association spreads fast, and they weren't willing to carry that weight. I didn't reach out to any of them. No calls, no texts, no attempts to mend what they'd broken. Doris tried calling once a week after the ruling, but I let it go to voicemail. Her message was short, her voice clipped. "We need to talk about this, Ruby." I deleted it. Shane sent another text accusing me of destroying the family, but I didn't respond. Lawrence stayed silent as he always had. I wasn't surprised. They'd made their choices long ago, and I was done chasing their approval. My focus was elsewhere, on building a life that didn't need their validation. Carla and Vernon were my anchors through it all. One evening, Carla invited me over for dinner at her place, a cozy apartment filled with the smell of homemade lasagna. We sat at her small kitchen table laughing over stories that had nothing to do with my family. "You're stronger than they'll ever understand," she said, passing me a slice of garlic bread. Vernon joined us later, his toolbox in hand from fixing my leaky sink earlier that day. "You don't need them," he said, his voice steady as he cracked open a soda. "You've got us." Those moments, eating, talking, laughing, felt like home more than any family gathering ever had. They didn't replace what I'd lost. They showed me what I'd gained. Wichita's tight-knit community kept talking. A local book club invited me to share my story, not for gossip, but to inspire others who'd been overlooked by their families. I didn't go, I wasn't ready, but their support lingered. My parents' house, once a hub for barbecues and holiday parties, grew quiet. Neighbors stopped dropping by. Their mailbox, once stuffed with invitations, held only bills. The truth I'd exposed didn't just cost them money. It stripped away the facade they'd spent years polishing. They weren't the victims here, and Wichita knew it. I didn't gloat. I didn't need their apologies or their regret. The lawsuit, the posts, the fallout, they weren't about revenge. They were about reclaiming my place, not in their family, but in my own life. As I sat with Carla and Vernon, their laughter filling the room, I felt a weight lift. I wasn't the daughter who'd been erased anymore. I was Ruby, building something new, surrounded by people who saw me for who I was. And that was enough. 3 months after the courtroom ruling, I stood in a small office in downtown Wichita, the lease freshly signed, the walls still bare but full of possibility. The money from the trust, my rightful share, wasn't just a number in my bank account. It was a chance to build something that mattered. I'd launched a nonprofit called Haven, a name that felt right for what I wanted to create, a safe space for people like me, those cast aside by their families, especially young women and others cut out of inheritances or left behind by those who should have cared. I'd been one of them, erased by my own blood, and I wasn't going to let anyone else feel that kind of alone. Haven wasn't just a project. It was my answer to every unanswered text, every ignored gift, every moment I'd been made to feel invisible. The first weeks were a blur. I hired a small team, mostly volunteers who'd heard my story through Wichita's grapevine. We set up workshops teaching women how to navigate legal battles over trusts, how to file claims, how to stand up when their families tried to write them out. I spent hours meeting with clients, single mothers, estranged siblings, people whose stories echoed mine. One woman, barely 20, told me how her parents had left everything to her brother, assuming she'd figure it out. I showed her how to request documents, how to find a lawyer, how to fight. Another client, a man in his 30s, had been cut from his family's will after coming out. We worked together to draft a case, and when he won a small settlement, he hugged me, tears in his eyes. Those moments didn't erase my past, but they gave it purpose. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was helping others do the same. Carla and Vernon were with me every step. Sunday mornings became our ritual, meeting at a diner on the edge of town for pancakes and coffee. Carla, always quick with a laugh, would tease me about my terrible taste in syrup, while Vernon, ever practical, would sketch ideas for Haven's logo on a napkin. One weekend, Vernon showed up at my apartment with a toolbox, insisting on fixing my creaky porch steps. Can't have the boss of a nonprofit tripping over her own stairs, he said, grinning as he hammered away. Carla joined us, bringing lemonade and stories about her latest teaching gig. Those mornings, those small moments felt like family, not the one I was born into, but the one I'd chosen. They didn't ask me to be anything other than me, and that was more than Doris Lawrence or Shane had ever done. I didn't hear from my family after the lawsuit. Doris's voicemail was the last I'd gotten, and I hadn't responded. Shane's texts stopped after his failed attempt to defend himself online. Lawrence, true to form, stayed silent. Bailey sent one final message, a vague wish for things to get better, but I let it sit unanswered. Curtis hadn't reached out at all. I didn't need their words or their apologies. I'd spent years chasing their approval, trying to fit into their story, but I was done. They'd made their choices, and I'd made mine. Wichita's whispers about their fall from grace didn't reach me anymore. I was too busy building something new. Haven grew faster than I'd expected. A local newspaper ran a feature on our work, calling it a lifeline for the overlooked. Community groups invited me to speak, and I shared what I'd learned, that family isn't defined by blood, but by who shows up when you need them. I wasn't preaching, I was living it. Every client I helped, every workshop I led, was proof I didn't need my parents' table to have a place in the world. I'd built my own, and it was stronger than anything they could have offered. One evening, as I locked up Haven's office, Carla called to check in. "You're doing something real," she said, her voice warm through the phone. "Don't forget that." I smiled, looking at the sign above the door, the word Haven catching the streetlight's glow. I didn't need Doris's pride or Lawrence's nod or Shane's spotlight. I had Carla's laughter, Vernon's steady presence, and a purpose that was mine alone. The ache of being erased hadn't vanished, but it didn't define me anymore. I'd turned it into something else, something that helped others stand taller than their pain. If you're watching this wondering if you're too much or not enough for the people who keep pushing you aside, let me tell you something: you don't need their permission to exist. You don't need their approval to build a life that matters. Family isn't the one you're born into. It's the one you create. The one that sees you, hears you, holds you up. I learned that the hard way, but I learned it. And you can too. Don't let their silence stop you. Stand up, build your own table, and choose who gets a seat. That's the truth I found, and it's the truth I'm passing on.
All these cards are maxed out, Mrs. Wilson, and they're all in your name. The bank representative's sympathetic tone did nothing to soften the blow of her words. She slid the statements across the desk, each one stamped with alarming red figures. "There must be some mistake," I insisted, my hands trembling as I flipped through the pages. "I only have one credit card, and I rarely use it. According to our records, your husband added you as an authorized user on these accounts. Your signatures are on all the applications." She pointed to a series of signatures that looked vaguely like mine, but with subtle differences that made my stomach drop. "I never signed these," I whispered, the implications washing over me like ice water. "I never even saw these cards." The representative's expression shifted from sympathy to concern. "Mrs. Wilson, the total outstanding balance across these 5 accounts is $45,287.63, and they're all 3 months past due." I sat in stunned silence, my mind racing to make sense of this information. Just 4 days ago, my husband of 13 years had packed a single suitcase, kissed our daughter goodbye while I was at the grocery store, and left a note on our kitchen counter. "Found someone who appreciates me. Don't try to contact me. We'll call about divorce proceedings." Now, as the bank representative explained my limited options, debt consolidation, payment plans, possible bankruptcy, the full extent of James's betrayal began to take shape. He hadn't just abandoned our marriage, he'd deliberately set me up for financial ruin. "My name is Margot Wilson, 31 years old, a part-time administrative assistant at a dental practice in Portland, Oregon. James and I met in college, married young, and had our daughter Sophie within a year. I had dreams of finishing my education, building a career in healthcare administration, maybe even traveling someday. Instead, I found myself juggling motherhood and part-time work while James pursued his career as a software developer. All I wanted now was stability for Sophie, a way to keep our modest home, maintain her school routine, and somehow dig us out of this financial hole James had left us in. The thought of my brilliant, sensitive 11-year-old daughter having to face the upheaval of bankruptcy and possible foreclosure made my chest ache with dread. As I drove home from the bank, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Margot, this is Heather. James told me you were controlling and financially abusive, but now I'm seeing things differently. Call me if you want to know what he's been hiding." Heather. The name James had whispered in his sleep twice last month. The name I'd pretended not to hear, convincing myself it was nothing. The knot in my stomach tightened. Whatever James had been hiding, I suspected the credit card debt was just the beginning. When I met James during sophomore year of college, he seemed like everything I'd been looking for: intelligent, ambitious, protective. My own childhood had been chaotic. Raised by a single mother who struggled with addiction, I'd grown up craving stability and security. James offered that, along with what I interpreted as love. We married quickly, partly because I was pregnant with Sophie, but also because James was eager to start our life together. He had a 5-year plan: finish his computer science degree, land a solid job in tech, buy a house, build a family. I put my nursing prerequisites on hold, planning to return once Sophie started school. But James's protective nature slowly morphed into something more controlling. He managed our finances completely, giving me a modest allowance for household expenses. He questioned my friendships, suggesting certain people were negative influences. When I mentioned returning to school, he emphasized how important my role at home was to Sophie's development. "You don't want our daughter raised by strangers, do you?" he'd ask whenever I brought up childcare options. Besides, the cost of tuition and daycare would be a waste when you're already so good at what matters most. I believed him because I wanted to, because the alternative meant acknowledging that my safe harbor had become a cage. So I adapted. I focused on Sophie, worked part-time when James deemed it acceptable, and gradually lost touch with friends and even family members who asked too many questions about our increasingly isolated life. There had been warning signs, of course. The unexplained late nights at work. The password-protected second phone he claimed was for client emergencies only. The way he'd quickly minimize his computer screen when I entered his home office. The growing emotional distance despite his continued control over nearly every aspect of our lives. 2 years ago, I'd found a receipt for an expensive Portland restaurant on a night he'd claimed to be working late. When confronted, James had turned it around so skillfully that I ended up apologizing for doubting him. "I was planning a surprise anniversary dinner," he'd said, his expression wounded. "I was scouting locations and now you've ruined it. Why can't you trust me, Margot?" I never saw that anniversary dinner. Instead, I received a bracelet ordered online, delivered to our door in a brown box. But I convinced myself it was my fault, that my suspicion had ruined his grand plans. I worked harder to be the wife and mother he wanted, silencing the small voice inside that whispered something was wrong. Even now, with 5 maxed-out credit cards in my name and a goodbye note on the counter, part of me wondered if there was something I could have done differently to prevent this outcome. I didn't call the number from the text right away. Instead, I picked up Sophie from school, maintaining a forced cheerfulness as she chatted about her day. "How do you tell your 11-year-old that her father has not only left, but has potentially ruined your financial future? That the home she's grown up in might not be hers much longer?" While Sophie did her homework, I sat at the kitchen table with a notepad, calculating our assets against the towering debt. My part-time job brought in about $1,800 monthly. Our mortgage was $1,400. Then utilities, groceries, Sophie's activities. The numbers didn't add up, no matter how many times I reworked them. My phone buzzed again. Another text from Heather. I understand if you don't trust me. I wouldn't either. But James has been lying to both of us. I can prove it. Almost against my will, I found myself dialing the number. Hello? The voice on the other end was younger than I expected, tinged with a slight southern accent. This is Margot Wilson, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. You texted about James. What followed was a 30-minute conversation that shattered any remaining illusions I had about my marriage. Heather Davis was 26, a graphic designer from Nashville who had met James in an online forum for gaming enthusiasts 9 months ago. Their relationship had evolved quickly, with James painting himself as an unhappily married man trapped by a controlling, financially irresponsible wife who refused to work and drained his resources. He told me you had gambling debts, Heather said, her voice cracking, that you'd maxed out credit cards and he was working extra jobs to cover it. He said you monitored his calls and emails, so we had to be careful about communication. None of that is true, I whispered, watching Sophie through the doorway as she concentrated on her math homework. I work. He controlled all our money, and now I'm discovering credit cards in my name that I never applied for. I'm so sorry, Heather replied, genuine remorse in her voice. I believed him completely until yesterday, when I found some inconsistencies in his stories. Then I discovered his laptop open and saw emails about transferring money from joint accounts. When I questioned him, he got defensive and finally admitted he'd been creative with some details about your relationship. My hands were shaking by the time we finished talking. Heather had sent screenshots of their conversations, including ones where James detailed plans to leave me with the debt while starting fresh with her. He had systematically withdrawn money from our modest savings account over the past 6 months. There were even messages about blocking my access to friends and family who might help me, a strategy to ensure I'd have nowhere to turn once he left. I sat in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of my husband's calculated betrayal, feeling more alone than I ever had in my life. The protective walls I'd built around our little family had turned out to be a prison, designed by the very person I trusted to keep us safe. The next morning, I called in sick to work and drove Sophie to school, fighting back tears as I watched her walk through the doors. She was the only good thing to come from my marriage, and I was determined to protect her from the worst of the situation. Back home, I began methodically documenting everything. I printed Heather's screenshots, gathered bank statements, and made notes about James's controlling behaviors over the years. If this was heading toward divorce, I needed evidence. But even as I assembled my case, a crushing reality settled over me. I had no money for a lawyer, no family nearby to help, and few friends left after years of James's subtle isolation tactics. By noon, overwhelmed and desperate, I called the one person who had tried to maintain contact despite James's disapproval, my former college roommate Diane. We hadn't spoken in nearly 2 years, not since James had claimed she'd made inappropriate comments about our marriage during her last visit. Margot, Diane's surprise was evident in her voice. Is everything okay? No, I admitted, and once I started talking, everything poured out. James's abandonment, the credit card debt, the revelations from Heather. Diane listened without interruption until I finally ran out of words. That manipulative bastard, she said with quiet fury. Listen to me, Margot. I'm coming over tonight, and I'm bringing help. I can't ask you to... You're not asking. I'm telling. James worked hard to cut you off from support, but he didn't succeed completely. There are people who care about you and Sophie. That evening, Diane arrived with a woman she introduced as Catherine, a family law attorney. I can't afford a lawyer, I said immediately. Catherine smiled. Diane and I go way back. Consider this initial consultation a favor. We'll figure out the rest as we go. For the next 2 hours, Catherine reviewed my documents and outlined potential approaches. She explained that while I might be liable for some of the credit card debt as James's spouse, there were options for contesting fraudulent charges and signatures. She suggested filing for an emergency hearing to freeze our remaining assets and potentially get temporary support for Sophie. For the first time since finding James's note, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe with proper legal guidance, I could navigate this crisis without losing everything. That hope was short-lived. The following day, I received an email from James. I've spoken with a lawyer. Since you've been an authorized user on all accounts and benefited from the purchases, you're equally responsible for the debt. I've also documented your refusal to work full-time as evidence of your financial dependence. I'm willing to let you keep the house if you assume all outstanding debts. My lawyer will be in touch with formal papers. Panic rose in my throat. Catherine had warned me about this possibility, that James might try to offload the debt entirely. Without full-time income or assets, I couldn't possibly manage the mortgage plus $45,000 in credit card payments. I forwarded the email to Catherine, who called me immediately. This is a scare tactic, she assured me. He's hoping you'll panic and agree to unfavorable terms, but we need to move quickly. That night, after putting Sophie to bed, I sat down at my computer to gather more financial documentation. What I found sent ice through my veins. James hadn't just maxed out credit cards, he'd also taken a $30,000 home equity line of credit against our house 3 months ago. The money was gone, withdrawn in cash increments just small enough to avoid triggering automatic fraud alerts. Our modest home, the one thing I thought might provide stability for Sophie, was now leveraged to the hilt. And worse, the first large payment on the equity line was due in 2 weeks. Mom, are you okay? I quickly closed the computer browser, wiping tears from my cheeks before turning to face Sophie, who stood in the doorway of our little home office in her pajamas. Just some grown-up stuff, sweetie. You should be in bed. Sophie approached cautiously, her expression far too serious for an 11-year-old. It's about Dad, isn't it? And money? I hesitated, torn between protecting her and being honest. What makes you think that? I heard you on the phone, she admitted, and I saw the bank papers on the table. Plus, Dad told me before he left that you might be sad for a while because of financial issues. He said it wasn't his fault. Anger flared in my chest at James's attempt to shape Sophie's understanding of his abandonment. Sophie, there's a lot happening right now that's complicated. Dad made some decisions that have put us in a difficult position, but I'm working on fixing it. Sophie sat beside me, her small hand covering mine. Don't cry, Mom, I'll help you. The determined optimism in her voice broke my heart and mended it simultaneously. That's very sweet, honey, but this isn't something you need to worry about. But I already am worried, she insisted, and I want to help. Ms. Winters says kids are more capable than adults think. Ms. Winters, Sophie's favorite teacher, who ran the school's community service club. I managed a small smile. Well, the best help would be just being patient while I figure things out. Maybe some extra chores around the house. Sophie nodded solemnly. I can do that, and more. After tucking her back into bed, I returned to the devastating financial discoveries. Between the credit cards, the home equity line, and our daily expenses, we were sinking in quicksand. Catherine had been optimistic about contesting the fraudulent credit card applications, but the home equity loan was different. It had been taken against our joint property, and I had apparently signed the paperwork. Except I hadn't. Just like the credit card applications, my signature had been forged, but proving that would take time and money, neither of which I had in abundance. The next morning brought another shock. I logged into our cellular account to find that James had terminated my phone service. When I called the company from Diane's phone, they informed me that he had removed me from our family plan, stating that we were separated and I had agreed to obtain my own service. It was a calculated move, cutting off my communication while maintaining his narrative that I was financially irresponsible. Without a phone, I'd struggle to communicate with Catherine, potential employers for additional work, or even Sophie's school in emergencies. Diane immediately added me to her family plan as a temporary solution, but James's message was clear. He was systematically dismantling the infrastructure of our shared life, leaving me scrambling to rebuild essential services while he moved on unencumbered. That afternoon, I received a certified letter containing separation papers. James was offering me the house, contingent on assuming all debts, and $300 monthly in child support, an insultingly low figure given his six-figure income. He was claiming that my voluntary underemployment should limit any additional support. The documents painted me as a financially dependent spouse who had refused opportunities for full-time work, choosing instead to live beyond our means through credit card spending. It was a complete inversion of reality, a reality where James had actively discouraged my career advancement and controlled every aspect of our finances. As I stared at the separation agreement, a new emotion began to overtake the shock and grief: determination. James had spent years carefully constructing this trap, believing I would have no resources to fight back. He was about to discover how wrong he was. "We need to be strategic," Catherine advised during our meeting the next day. "James has created a paper trail to support his narrative. We need evidence to counter it. Proof of his control over finances, your attempts to work more hours, the forgeries." I spread my limited documentation across her desk. Bank statements showing James as the primary account holder with me merely as an authorized user. Emails where I'd asked about our financial situation and received vague responses. Texts where he'd discouraged me from accepting additional hours at work. "It's not much," I admitted. He was careful. "People like James always make mistakes," Catherine assured me. "Their overconfidence leads to carelessness. We just need to find where he slipped up." Over the next week, I threw myself into building my case. I requested security footage from the bank where the home equity loan had been processed, hoping to prove I hadn't been present for the signing. I contacted my employer about increasing my hours and documenting James's past calls to check if I was really needed when asked to work overtime. I even reached out to Heather, who had agreed to provide a statement about James's misrepresentations. Meanwhile, Sophie had grown increasingly determined to help in her own ways. She insisted on making her own lunches, took over several household chores without being asked, and even set up a lemonade stand on our street corner one weekend, bringing home $12 in quarters that she solemnly presented to me for the bills. "Honey, that's so sweet, but you don't need to worry about money," I told her, fighting back tears. "I know," she said with surprising confidence, "but I wanted to do something while we wait for everyone else to help, too." "Everyone else?" I asked, confused. Sophie's eyes widened slightly before she shrugged. "You know, like Ms. Diane and the lawyer lady." Something about her response struck me as odd, but I was too overwhelmed with immediate concerns to pursue it. Those concerns multiplied when I checked our mailbox the following day to find a notice from the mortgage company. Despite the home equity loan being less than 3 months old, a payment had been missed. I called immediately, only to discover that James had changed the account contact information to his new address and phone number. The representative could tell me little beyond confirming that we were now 30 days delinquent on both the mortgage and the equity line. That evening, Catherine called with mixed news. "The bank footage doesn't show you present for the equity loan signing," she said, "which supports our forgery claim. However, the papers themselves have a notary seal which complicates things." "How is that possible if I wasn't there?" "Either the notary failed to properly verify identity, or James found someone to impersonate me," I finished, the realization hitting hard. Could he really have gone that far? "People in the midst of deception rarely recognize boundaries," Catherine said grimly. "We'll subpoena the notary and find out." Just as we were wrapping up the call, my doorbell rang. Standing on my porch was a sheriff's deputy with another certified letter. This one, a notice of foreclosure proceedings initiated by the mortgage holder. "But this can't be right," I protested, scanning the document with growing horror. "We're only 1 month behind." "The notice cites violation of loan terms," the deputy pointed out, indicating a paragraph about material misrepresentation on the equity line application. As the deputy left, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Thought you were clever getting your girlfriend to contact my wife? Back off, or I'll make sure you and Sophie end up on the street by month's end." James had discovered my communication with Heather and was escalating his tactics. But he had made a critical error. He had explicitly threatened our daughter in writing. And that, I realized with sudden clarity, might be exactly the mistake Catherine had predicted. 3 months after James walked out, my phone rang with a number I recognized instantly. "Margot, we need to talk," James said without preamble, his voice tense. "Things have gotten out of hand." "I'm listening," I replied calmly, signaling Sophie to continue her homework at the kitchen table while I stepped onto our front porch. "The bank is investigating the equity loan for fraud. My accounts are frozen. What did you do?" I smiled despite myself. "I didn't do anything, James. You did this." "Cut the innocent act," he snapped. "You've been trying to ruin me. Heather left because of your lies. The bank is talking about pressing charges. I need you to tell them this was a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding, like forging my signature, impersonating me to a notary, maxing out fraudulent credit cards in my name?" Each question was delivered evenly, without the emotional tremor that would have been present just weeks before. James's tone shifted from accusatory to pleading. "Look, I made some bad decisions. I was stressed about money, about us. But I can't have fraud charges on my record. I'll lose my job, everything." "That's unfortunate," I acknowledged. "But as you've reminded me repeatedly, actions have consequences. For God's sake, Margot, what do you want from me?" "Nothing anymore," I replied truthfully. "But I think you should come by the house tonight at 7. There are some people you should meet." "What people? Is this some kind of trap?" "Not a trap, James. An education." I ended the call, then turned to find Sophie watching me through the window, giving me a thumbs up with a proud smile. When I came inside, she wrapped her arms around my waist. "Was that Dad? Is he coming tonight to meet everyone?" "Yes," I confirmed, finally understanding her earlier cryptic comments. "Sophie, what exactly have you been up to these past few weeks?" My daughter's smile widened into a grin that reminded me, suddenly and powerfully, of my own mother's determined expression when facing challenges. "I've been building our community circle, just like Ms. Winters taught us." At precisely 7 o'clock, James arrived at our front door, his expression wary. He stepped inside and froze, clearly unprepared for the scene before him. Our modest living room was filled with people, some familiar, others I had only recently met. Diane sat beside Catherine on the sofa. My supervisor from the dental office stood near the fireplace, chatting with 2 other dental assistants. Sophie's teacher, Ms. Winters, was arranging refreshments on the dining table with help from 3 mothers from Sophie's school. My elderly neighbor, Mr. Patel, sat in an armchair, while his wife handed out coffee cups. Even Heather was there, having flown in from Nashville specifically for this moment. "What is this?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sophie stepped forward, a sheet of paper in her hands. "It's our community circle, Dad. When you left, I knew Mom would need help, so I made a list of everyone who might care about us." She handed him the paper, a meticulously drawn map of connections, with Sophie and me at the center, radiating outward to dozens of names, neighbors, teachers, parents of Sophie's friends, my co-workers, even distant family members James had discouraged me from contacting. "You isolated Mom from her friends, but you forgot about my friends," Sophie explained with disarming directness. "And their parents, and my teachers, and our neighbors." James looked around the room, recognition dawning as he realized these weren't just random supporters. They were witnesses to his deceptions and contributors to our recovery. Diane had helped me secure a full-time position with benefits at another dental practice. Catherine had worked pro bono to document the fraud and negotiate with creditors. Ms. Winters had organized a support network of school families who provided meals, childcare, and emotional support. Mr. Patel, a retired accountant, had been helping me rebuild my credit and create a sustainable budget. Together, they had formed the safety net James had systematically tried to dismantle. "You thought I had no one," I said quietly. "You were wrong." As James stood speechless, Sophie took my hand. See, Mom? I told you I would help. And she had, more profoundly than she could possibly understand. Through my daughter's wisdom and courage, I had rediscovered not just resources I didn't know I had, but strength I had forgotten existed within me. The community circle continued to gather around us, a living testament to the truth that relationship wealth will always be more valuable than financial wealth. And as I watched James retreat, diminished by the realization of what he had lost, I felt not triumph but gratitude for my remarkable daughter, for our rebuilt connections, and for the opportunity to begin again, surrounded by people who truly cared.